You are now watching On Point, a news and public affairs show from California State University Northridge.
Welcome to On Point. We're a student-led public affairs show based on the CSUN campus. This week's show explores racism and the lasting effect it has on mental health within the Black community to this day. Black people make up 13% of the American population, but make up over a third of American prison population. The disparities between these numbers reflect the racism in America's criminal justice system. This includes the over-policing of Black communities and racist sentencing practices. Other systematic policies such as gerrymandering and occupation segregation have made it so that Black people in communities are less likely to own homes than the rest of the population. There's also a wealth gap, with Black adults only having 1/5 of the average savings compared to the white adults. Discrimination in America can be traced back centuries. It's discussed in history books, higher education institutions, and government reports. But discrimination and its impact on mental health within the Black community has only been explored within the last 2 decades. Today we'll be taking a deeper dive into this topic. Our first guest is an Africana Studies professor here at CSUN. Victoria Richards was previously an elementary school teacher for over a decade, and she spends her time now advocating for mental health and wellness within the Black community. Hi, Victoria. It's nice to have you today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yes. So I want to start off by asking you the question of what is trauma and what is racialized trauma?
Trauma is when something bad happens to us, so much so that we can no longer be the person that we were before the trauma happened. And it sticks with us for life. And that could be anything from sexual assault, participating in wars, seeing someone get murdered, being beaten, having a heart attack, getting a bad diagnosis from your doctor. Racialized trauma, on the other hand, is a little bit different. That's when what we experience as Black people, where we're constantly being picked on and talked about and experiencing discrimination, overt racism. We're experiencing microaggressions. And the day-to-day of it starts to wear on our psyches and our self-esteem, creates anger and a feeling of displacement and not belonging.
What does post-traumatic slave disorder look like with someone struggling with it? You did mention earlier racial trauma and how microaggressions can affect one's health. What does that look like? How might it impact their health?
So, Dr. Joy DeGraw did her dissertation on post-traumatic slave syndrome, and basically what that is the effects of generations of slavery, discrimination, Jim Crow, and the effects that it has on us today. And so when you are faced with generations and a legacy of discrimination and racism, you start to see certain characteristics that are common among African Americans. Again, the feeling of not belonging. Then there's also the doom, like something bad. You're always waiting for something bad to happen. Colorism is an effect of post-traumatic slave syndrome. The look. And so, I'm talking about the look. And then we're also always looking for that look where it's like, do you actually see me? Or if you see me, are you seeing those things about me that I don't like? It's like the worst thing you can do is look at a Black person.
Right.
Weird.
Right.
And so we have numerous effects that show us just even how we talk to our children. We're afraid to really brag about them because that can lead to consequences and repercussions. And so, but our children are sitting there hearing us not brag about them, and it's like, am I good enough? And so we pass down these traumas from generation to generation to generation in our child rearing practices And some of our child rearing practices come directly from how we were treated and disciplined during slavery.
Why do you think serious mental illness rates rose from 2008 through 2018 within the African American community?
Well, I can definitely say 2016, we had the election of Donald Trump. And while him being president is him being president, while he was president, people that didn't say or didn't do certain things are now saying and doing things that they didn't do before. And so we have to constantly hear about it and constantly hear the negative stereotypes, the negative justifications for treating Black people badly. So if we're going to go all the way back to 2008, we can also see an uptick in the use of social media, where before you could go out into the world, maybe experience certain microaggressions or even overt racism, and then go home and have some peace. But now with the advent of cell phones and we're just carrying them around with us, we never get a break, ever, from the negative thoughts, the negative comments, the stereotypes, the constant beratement.
What is the difference between race-based traumatic stress and then post-traumatic slave disorder? Well, are they stemmed by the same things, or is it just a technical name difference?
Well, they're definitely different, but they also are similar. So post-traumatic slave syndrome is the effects that come down from being enslaved in the United States of America, whereas racialized trauma is the day-to-day experiencing of overt racism and microaggression. Typically for African Americans, we experience both. But like say someone immigrated over from Africa, they didn't have to deal with the post-traumatic slave syndrome. But then once they get here, now they're being treated and targeted just for being Black. When back home, they didn't even think about Blackness.
Exactly.
And so they'll experience the same stereotypes, the same comments, the same treatment. And that's a good example of how post-traumatic slave syndrome and racialized trauma are different, but they're similar.
Okay. Thank you for that insight. Our reporter, Micah Hall, went out and found an organization focused on assisting some of the people's most susceptible to systematic racism. He took a dive into organizations that help African American youth in Los Angeles.
100 Black Men of Los Angeles is a nonprofit organization that supports the underrepresented in the young Black community. Their goal is to improve the quality of life for young African Americans by providing different resources. Jewett L. Walker is a member of the 100 Black Men of Los Angeles.
Well, the Young Black Scholars Club is designed for middle school and high school students. Consequently, you're dealing with people from 11 to 17 years old.
Most of their offices are located at West LA College. The organization goes beyond the typical school lessons. A CSUN freshman who is also part of the program, Troy Thomas, explains his experience with the organization.
Partnership and communication skills, working alongside others. And I feel like these are all attributes that every Black student needs.
The organization focuses on mentoring, education, health and wellness, economic empowerment, and leadership, all which can make someone's life easier.
One of the things that we discovered was that African Americans were not being admitted to the UC or the Cal State schools at a percentage representing their population generally. So we started a program called Young Black Scholars.
The current president of 100 Black Men of Los Angeles is Kirk Williams. Jewett Walker describes him as an outstanding member of the organization. He also says that he is a hard worker. Reporting from Los Angeles, I'm Micah Hall for CSUN On Point.
Thank you, Micah. When we return, we'll be speaking with a licensed psychotherapist who focuses on culturally based care. will speak about how the community can focus on mental wellness in the face of race-based trauma.
You're not going to get it all right. Just make sure you nail the big stuff, like making sure your kids are in the right seat for their age and size. Get it right at nhtsa.gov/the-right-seat.
Welcome back to On Point, a news and public affairs show based of California State University of Northridge. Today we're speaking about race-based trauma and post-traumatic slave disorder. Our next guest is Marilyn Julia Brown. She's a psychotherapist and a spiritual teaching practitioner who focuses on generational trauma as well as culturally affirming therapy. Thank you so much for being with us today, Marilyn.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So my first question would be to you is, people in the white community seek mental health care at nearly twice as much as those within the Black community. From your own personal experience, what do you think the reasoning is behind that?
I think there's a lot of reasons behind that. There, unfortunately, is still a lot of stigma in our community, in the Black community, around mental health and having diagnosis or any kind of mental health issue. I think a lot of times, like, we've moved past some of that. I think we've definitely generationally that's starting to change, but you still hear a lot of people feeling like they need to wait until they're in extreme crisis before seeking help. And a lot of times that's when, not saying it's too late, but you really could benefit from seeking help way before you're in a crisis state. But a lot of times people just don't even know that. I think that also in our community, therapy is still just not something that people talk openly about. And so even though there are people that are utilizing mental health services, it's not something that is promoted in a way where it feels normal and healthy, you know.
What practices can a person implement to heal from things like depression and anxiety? Like, let's say, even if they are clinically diagnosed and they are on medication, what can they do at home to strengthen the process of healing?
One of the main things that I teach and I work with clients on is implementing some sort of mindfulness practice. And so mindfulness is basically being present in the moment, fully present in the moment without judgment. And so that without judgment piece is really helpful, because when you're able to exist in an experience and allow yourself to experience it without judging it as bad or wrong or problematic in some way, then you're able to have some clarity to be able to move forward. And so the thing about mindfulness that people don't realize is that it's not just sitting and meditating. That's one way to practice mindfulness, but there's thousands of ways to practice mindfulness. You can pretty much do anything that you do mindfully. And so even like on my drive here, I live in San Diego, I drove here, I spent like 10 minutes on the road just focusing on what I was doing and really fully being present in that experience, because usually we're doing things and we're distracted and we're multitasking. And so mindfulness is really being able to bring yourself to that place of groundedness and being able to exist in the moment as it is. And so that's one of the things that I help and teach my clients to do.
Those are good tactics to know. I'm glad that you shared that with everyone. Why do you think white teens attempt suicide at two-thirds less than African American teens? Is that going back again to what you previously brought up, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think that's a part of it, is that our teens are still not feeling safe to be able to get help and to speak up and kind of be honest about what they're experiencing. And I also think what we recognize is that being a Black person in America, you experience more trauma, more, with racism and microaggressions and macroaggressions and all of these different experiences. There's a higher rate of trauma that you experience. And so I think that's what's leading to a much higher rate And I also think the rates have gone up significantly since COVID. And I think that has a lot to do with the isolation that people have experienced during COVID. There's been a lot of loss and grief. And so it's something that there's a higher incidence of what they call deaths of despair, which are alcoholism deaths, deaths from overdose, and suicide as well, but kind of across the board. But you're going to see it more in the Black community because pretty much everything that we experience as a collective, we end up getting even more.
Okay.
Yeah.
You specialize in brain spotting therapy, right? And DBT therapy?
Yes, yes.
Would you mind explaining that a little bit? DBT therapy and then brain spotting therapy?
Yes, so I'll start with DBT. So DBT is dialectical behavior therapy. So it is a form of cognitive behavior therapy. DBT started in like 1993, and it's really been, it's one of the most evidence-based therapy practices out there. That is used, it's effective. It was actually initially developed for people who had the most chronic suicidality and most chronic depression. So really the patients who really had the hardest time. And it's really effective, and it's a blend of cognitive behavior therapy, so thinking about your thoughts and how your thoughts affect your feelings, which affect your behaviors. And then also blending that mindfulness piece that I talked about and actually teaching people how to create mindfulness in their lives. So that's DBT, and that's something that people can, like, you could get a workbook and learn DBT on your own, but you can also do DBT with a therapist in a full program. And then brain spotting is something that's a little bit different. So it's an intervention, it's a therapeutic intervention, but it's not as manualized as DBT. DBT has like 4 modules. You learn emotion regulation, you learn interpersonal effectiveness, you learn mindfulness, and you learn distress tolerance. Brain spotting is specifically a technique that was developed by a Dr. David Grand, who discovered that where we look actually affects how we feel. And that our eyes unconsciously move to certain areas that unprocessed trauma is lodged in the brain. And so brain spotting actually unlocks that and allows you to process that trauma in the moment.
That is very intriguing.
It's really cool. Yeah.
Our reporter, Micah Hall, was able to speak with an activist in the Black community who walked with Dr. Martin Luther King and continues to enrich the community to this day.
Pastor Jeffrey Joseph Sr. is a 93-year-old pastor and former civil rights activist. He also marched with Martin Luther King Jr. Over 6 decades ago in Jennings, Louisiana, Pastor Joseph began to preach equality over the radio. His sermon was, "Out of one blood, God created all mankind to dwell upon the face of the earth." Joseph's former pastor, Jeff Peterson, thought this was a bad idea.
I begged my father to tell me not to preach that kind of sermon anymore, because that will get us all killed.
Pastor Joseph's son, Jeffrey Joseph Jr., who was also the co-pastor, explains what his father taught him.
To learn to care about my fellow man regardless of who they are, not only in America, but all over the world.
Pastor Joseph is a forgiving man, but he will never forget the evil acts he has witnessed from others.
The Ku Klux Klan hanging people and shooting people.
Pastor Joseph expresses how he felt after everything he witnessed in the South.
It has a lot of effect on me, willing to die, to speak what I thought was right to speak.
Despite all the racism, police brutality, and the aftermath of death that Pastor Reverend Jeffrey Joseph Sr. has experienced throughout his life, he still shows no hate to any other race. Reporting from Pacoima, I'm Micah Hall for CSUN On Point.
Thank you for that, Micah. When we come back, we'll be speaking to both guests about realities of race-based trauma and its effect on the Black communities today.
Recently, the western U.S. has averaged more than 1,900 earthquakes and 3,800 significant wildfires each year. So chances are there will be more of both near here again. And between school, sports, and social lives, chances are you won't be with your kids when it happens. Will they know what to do? Ready.gov/kids has all the educational tools and information to make the conversation easy. When the time comes, chances are they'll feel prepared, not scared. So talk with your family today.
Welcome back to On Point. Now we're going to have both guests come back to speak about mental health in the Black community and the response to systematic racism and race-based trauma. We're sitting with Victoria Richards, an Africana Studies professor here at CSUN, and also a health advocate for mental health and wellness in the Black community. We also have Marilyn Julia Brown, a psychotherapist who focuses on generational trauma as well as culturally aware treatment. Thank you so much for joining us again, ladies. So my first question for the both of you would be, what is the difference between post-traumatic slave disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder? When I was reading, both of the symptoms sound really alike. And if they're so similar, why aren't they classified under the same kind of like umbrella?
Well, post-traumatic stress disorder is usually a single event, whereas post-traumatic slave syndrome is multiple events that keep reigniting the trauma over and over and over and over again.
So it's repeated trauma. Okay.
Repeated trauma passed down from generation to generation.
Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, to add to that, like post-traumatic stress disorder there is complex trauma that is where it can be smaller, like they say there's big T traumas, which are like war,
car accident,
like big events, but then there's what they classified as little T traumas that are like the effects of poverty, the effects of neglect, those kind of things that may be more ongoing and happening for a long time. But I think that one of the biggest differences that I see with post-traumatic slave syndrome is that there are specific things to descendants of slavery that are not classified under any other PTSD. So for example, what the professor was talking about in her segment about how we rear our children and like being afraid to brag about your kids and kind of promote them in that way, there's something different about that doesn't come out in other types of trauma that you see specifically for people whose families came through slavery and experienced that type of the way our families were ripped apart because of slavery. There's a different aspect of trauma. Also, the separation of families is another part of that post-traumatic slave syndrome that comes up that's different and can actually be compounded with PTSD. So you can have PTSD and post-traumatic slave syndrome all going on at the same time. Yeah.
So just going back to it affecting how we parent, how can untreated mental health disorders or behaviors affect parenting styles? And do you guys have any personal experiences with how that may have affected how you parent or what kind of parenting style you received growing up?
Yeah, so I definitely think that one of the challenges that comes up with having a parent with undiagnosed mental health issues, or maybe even it is diagnosed, but they're not able to get the right treatment, or there's barriers to access to care. And so that's one of the other issues that we see that's specific to Black community, is that there are all of these other barriers to getting care. So a lot of times people have to find really creative ways to kind of adapt to their experiences and don't even realize that it wasn't healthy, that like they were experiencing neglect, that they didn't get what they needed. And so being able to work with clients now who are in adulthood and didn't even realize that they actually experienced a traumatic childhood. And there's a survey called the ACEs survey that'll go through and you rate on these specific things, and I see people's eyes kind of widen when they realize, wow, I actually have a really high ACE score, and I never even realized that because it's so normal, the kind of trauma that I experienced.
Victoria, do you have anything to add with that?
I think for the children, it's very traumatizing in itself because you don't really realize that your parent is acting this way or behaving this way because they're traumatized. And so as a little kid, it's like you're 2, 3, 12, your mom or your dad is lashing out or being hypersensitive, and you don't really realize that they're behaving this way because they're afraid for you because of their experiences. And as a child, you're just like, well, why doesn't mommy like me, or why doesn't daddy love me? And that creates more trauma for the children.
Thank you both for that insight. For me personally, a lot of bonding experiences with friends accelerated my coping and acceptance of certain life events. At one point during the pandemic, I had kind of like a found sister circle, and that helped me it helped me with getting through the pandemic and all that we were facing. So my question would be, how does community and culture play a role in the healing or coping process after experiencing traumatic events, whether it be one time or ongoing?
And so just being able to talk to people about what you're going through, and then the community seeing that you're not alone and that other people are experiencing what you're experiencing is a great coping mechanism. I'm always a fan of find your friends and get a therapist, because you don't want to burden them to the point where it's just like,
Yeah.
pay the therapist for that. But you still need that outlet and the connection.
Perfect. Thank you. Anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I think
Marilyn.
community culture is really, really vital in healing trauma. Actually, one of the organizations that I work with in LA, Black Emotional and Mental Healing Collective, the whole goal is to eliminate barriers to healing for Black people specifically. And so they have groups and meetings and trainings and things. And what we recognize is that when you see yourself and other people, when you're able to validate your own experience, that there's a strength that comes from that. There's an empowerment that comes from that. And also I think culture is important because everybody's not going to be comfortable in the same groups.
Right.
Everybody's not going to be comfortable with the same type of therapy style, and we all have different ways of communicating. And so being in a space where you can fully be your Black self and not feel uncomfortable with that is really, really important to healing.
Thank you, Marilyn. We appreciate that input. Thank you for watching On Point, a student-run news and public affairs show run by student journalists on the CSUN campus. We want to thank our guests, Victoria and Marilyn, for coming in today and sharing some of their expertise and insight on this grand topic. I'm Savannah Taylor, and you can catch us every week here for On Point.